Imagine being trapped 7 miles above the Atlantic Ocean in complete darkness with 306 souls aboard a massive aircraft that's about to become the world's heaviest glider. The engines have gone silent, the lights have failed, and the only sound is the whistle of wind across the wings as gravity pulls you toward the black waters below. This isn't a movie, this is the true story of how two pilots faced an impossible choice: attempt the longest unpowered flight in aviation history or watch everyone aboard perish in the icy Atlantic. What happened next would rewrite the textbooks on aviation survival and human psychology under extreme pressure. Before starting the video, please, it will take 1 second. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you so much. Flight 236 started like any other transatlantic crossing, routine, predictable, boring even. Captain Rodriguez had flown this route dozens of times, and his passengers were settling in for what they expected to be an uneventful 7-hour journey to their European destination. The Airbus A330 was a technological marvel equipped with hundreds of sensors and backup systems designed to prevent exactly what was about to unfold. But sometimes the most sophisticated machines fail in the most primitive ways. Deep within the belly of the aircraft, a tiny hydraulic line was vibrating against a fuel pipe, wearing through metal with each pulse. Nobody knew that this microscopic erosion would soon trigger a catastrophic chain of events that would test the limits of human skill and courage. At 35,000 feet over the middle of nowhere, strange readings began appearing on the pilot's instruments. Engine oil pressure climbing when it should be steady. Oil temperature dropping when it should be rising. Oil quantity decreasing when it should remain constant. Captain Rodriguez had accumulated over 15,000 flight hours, but he'd never seen this combination of warnings before. His co-pilot, Sarah Chen, was equally puzzled. They pulled out their emergency procedures manual, a book thicker than a phone directory, and searched for answers. Page after page revealed nothing that matched their symptoms. The aircraft manufacturer's manual, the airline's procedures, even the engine manufacturer's guidance, none of it explained what they were seeing. Unknown to them, these weren't instrument malfunctions at all, but the first symptoms of a disaster unfolding in real time. Here's something fascinating about human psychology. When faced with information that doesn't fit our expectations, our brains work overtime to make it fit. The pilots were experiencing what psychologists call confirmation bias, the tendency to interpret new information in ways that confirm our existing beliefs. They believed their instruments were malfunctioning because the alternative was almost unthinkable. A catastrophic fuel leak on a nearly new aircraft during the smoothest part of the flight with no external cause? It seemed impossible. So when more warning signs appeared, instead of reconsidering their initial assessment, they doubled down on their belief that the instruments were lying. This cognitive trap, which serves us well in normal circumstances, was about to become their greatest enemy in a crisis where every minute counted. 30 minutes after the first strange readings, another alert chimed in the cockpit: fuel imbalance. The left wing tanks showed normal levels, but the right wing was reading significantly lower. In airline operations, fuel imbalances happen occasionally and are usually minor issues. The standard procedure is simple: open the cross-feed valve and let fuel flow from the fuller tank to the emptier one. Captain Rodriguez and First Officer Chen followed this routine procedure without hesitation. They watched as fuel began transferring from left to right, expecting the imbalance to correct itself within minutes. But instead of stabilizing, something unprecedented happened. The total fuel quantity began dropping at an alarming rate. They were essentially feeding fuel directly into a massive leak, accelerating their own doom while trying to fix what they thought was a minor problem. Aviation has a term called the point of no return. The moment when you've traveled so far that you can't go back to where you started, but you're not yet sure you can reach your destination. Flight 236 crossed this threshold in the worst possible way. Their fuel calculations, which had been perfectly normal for the first 4 hours of flight, suddenly showed they couldn't reach Europe. They were over the deepest part of the Atlantic with only one option: a tiny airport on a volcanic island in the middle of nowhere. The Azores, a Portuguese archipelago that most passengers had never heard of, became their only hope. But even diverting to this remote outpost would require precise fuel management and perfect flying conditions. With their fuel gauges showing impossible readings and their understanding of the situation fundamentally flawed, they were navigating toward a destination they might never reach. What the pilots didn't know was that their crisis had been set in motion days earlier in a maintenance hangar. A technician, working under time pressure during a routine engine service, had installed a part that looked identical to the correct component but was actually designed for a different aircraft model. The difference was measured in millimeters, barely visible to the naked eye, but catastrophic in its consequences. This single part caused a hydraulic line to make contact with a fuel pipe, creating a wear point that would eventually rupture under normal flight conditions. It's a perfect example of how modern aviation's complexity can create failure modes that are virtually impossible to predict. One tiny mistake, compounded by the psychological factors affecting the flight crew, was about to create aviation history. Modern aircraft are designed to make pilots feel in control even when systems are failing. The Airbus A330's sophisticated computers continue to provide precise readouts, maintain stable flight, and respond to control inputs even as fuel hemorrhaged from the aircraft at over 200 gallons per minute. This technological sophistication created a dangerous illusion everything seemed manageable, controllable, fixable. The pilots could still talk to air traffic control, execute course changes, and follow their diversion procedures. The passengers remained unaware of any problem. But beneath this veneer of normalcy, physics was taking over. Gravity doesn't negotiate and jet engines don't run on hope. The aircraft was bleeding its lifeblood into the atmosphere, and all the computer sophistication in the world couldn't change that fundamental reality. As the crisis deepened, the pilots found themselves in a communication paradox. They could talk to anyone. Air traffic control, their airline's operations center, maintenance experts on the ground, but nobody fully understood what was happening. The maintenance team, working from incomplete information transmitted over scratchy radio connections, couldn't visualize the real-time situation in the cockpit. Air traffic controllers, trained to handle routine diversions, had never dealt with an aircraft that might run out of fuel before reaching any airport. The airline's operations center could see the flight's position on their screens but couldn't access the detailed fuel data that would have revealed the severity of the leak. In an age of instant global communication, the people who needed help most were essentially alone with their problem, racing against time and physics with inadequate information and no precedent to guide them. Buried in the aircraft's emergency procedures manual was a section that could have saved the day: fuel leak procedures. These protocols, written by engineers who had considered this exact scenario, provided step-by-step instructions for identifying and managing fuel leaks. But here's the cruel irony: the procedures required the pilots to first believe they had a fuel leak. The checklist began with the assumption that crews would recognize the leak's symptoms and choose to follow the appropriate protocol. In this case, confirmation bias and the incredible nature of the situation prevented that recognition until it was too late. The fuel leak procedure called for an immediate descent to 20,000 feet and specific engine management techniques that would have preserved enough fuel to reach the Azores safely. Instead, the pilots maintained their high altitude, unwittingly maximizing their fuel burn rate and sealing their fate. Psychology research has identified a cognitive trap called framing bias. How we perceive risk depends entirely on how options are presented to us. Captain Rodriguez faced a terrible choice: descend to 20,000 feet following the fuel leak procedure, a certain loss of altitude and fuel efficiency, or maintain 35,000 feet, an uncertain, a potentially catastrophic risk if the fuel readings were accurate. His brain, like most human brains under stress, chose the uncertain catastrophic risk over the certain moderate loss. This decision-making pattern is so predictable that psychologists can recreate it in laboratory settings. But in a laboratory, the stakes are imaginary points or small amounts of money. At 35,000 feet over the Atlantic, this cognitive bias was about to determine whether 306 people lived or died. At exactly 6:13 a.m. Greenwich Mean Time, the right engine's fuel supply finally ran dry. The massive turbofan, which had been consuming fuel and air to produce 70,000 pounds of thrust, suddenly went silent. In the cockpit, warning lights illuminated like a Christmas tree and a mechanical voice announced engine failure with emotionless precision. Captain Rodriguez's training kicked in immediately: maximum power on the remaining engine, begin descent, declare emergency. But even as he executed these procedures flawlessly, a terrible realization was dawning: if one engine had failed due to fuel starvation, the other would follow soon. The A330 could fly on one engine, but not for long, and certainly not with the fuel quantities they were showing. They had perhaps 10 or 15 minutes before becoming a glider. The race was now between their remaining fuel and the distance to the Azores airport. 13 minutes later, with the airport still 75 miles away, the left engine joined its partner in silence. The sudden quiet was deafening. Gone was the reassuring roar that had accompanied them across the Atlantic, replaced by an eerie whistle of wind over the aircraft's surfaces. In the passenger cabin, people looked up from their books and movies, sensing something was wrong but not understanding what. The lights dimmed as the aircraft's electrical system switched to emergency power. Oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling as the cabin began to depressurize. Flight attendants, trained for this moment but hoping never to experience it, began preparing 293 passengers for what they euphemistically called a water landing. Everyone aboard understood the reality. They were about to attempt something that had never been successfully accomplished, ditching a wide-body airliner in the Atlantic Ocean at night. An Airbus A330 weighs roughly 400,000 pounds when fully loaded, about the same as 40 school buses. It's designed to fly efficiently with engines providing thrust, but as a glider, it has all the aerodynamic grace of a falling piano. The aircraft's glide ratio, the relationship between horizontal distance traveled and vertical distance lost, was roughly 20-to-1 under ideal conditions. But these weren't ideal conditions. Night flying eliminated visual references, partial hydraulic failure made the controls sluggish, and the need to maintain minimum airspeed for electrical power generation limited the pilot's options. Captain Rodriguez had to maintain at least 140 knots to keep the ram air turbine spinning and generating electricity, but couldn't exceed 200 knots or the landing gear wouldn't extend. Threading this narrow needle while descending at 2,000 feet per minute toward an invisible runway required precision that most pilots never achieve even under normal conditions. In the darkened cabin, 293 passengers were experiencing their own psychological journey through the crisis. Flight attendants moved through the aisles with practiced calm, demonstrating brace positions and reviewing emergency procedures. Some passengers prayed, others wrote what they believed might be final messages to loved ones, and a few maintained an almost supernatural calm. Children looked to adults for reassurance, while parents struggled to remain composed for their kids' sake. The human capacity for hope is remarkable. Even facing almost certain death, people found ways to believe they might survive. Conversations turned to practical matters. Who should be contacted if they didn't make it, where important documents were located, expressions of love that had been left unsaid. In the space of 20 minutes, strangers became intimate companions facing mortality together. Lodge's airport in the Azores exists primarily to support military operations, not to receive emergency commercial flights. The runway, while long enough for large aircraft, lacked many of the safety features that major airports take for granted. The approach lighting system was basic, the emergency response equipment was limited, and the controllers had never handled an emergency of this magnitude. As word spread that a large airliner was attempting an unpowered landing, every available emergency vehicle on the island converged on the airport. Fire trucks, ambulances, and rescue personnel prepared for what everyone assumed would be a catastrophic crash landing. The airport's isolation, which made it their only option for diversion, also meant that additional emergency resources were hours away. Whatever happened in the next few minutes would have to be handled with whatever resources were immediately available. Navigation without engines requires a fundamental shift in thinking. Powered aircraft can adjust their approach by adding thrust to climb or extend the flight path. Gliders have only one chance, and the mathematics are unforgiving. Captain Rodriguez had to solve a three-dimensional puzzle in real time, balance altitude, airspeed, and distance to arrive at the runway threshold with just enough energy to land safely. Too high, and he'd overshoot the runway. Too low, and they'd crash short of the airport. The calculations were complicated by the aircraft's damaged systems, limited control authority, reduced hydraulic power, and missing flight instruments. He was essentially flying by instinct and experience, making constant micro-adjustments based on visual cues and the feel of the aircraft. Every decision was irreversible, every mistake potentially fatal. 8 miles from the runway, Captain Rodriguez faced every pilot's nightmare scenario. He was too high to make a normal approach. In a powered aircraft, this would be a minor inconvenience: reduce power, deploy speed brakes, make a steeper approach. But in a glider, altitude is life itself, and deliberately losing it seems counterintuitive. Yet that's exactly what he had to do. Rodriguez made the decision to perform a 360-degree turn, essentially flying a circle to burn off excess altitude. For half of this maneuver, the aircraft was flying away from the airport, its nose pointed out toward the dark Atlantic. Passengers who could see out the windows watched in confusion as their destination disappeared behind them. The psychological pressure on Rodriguez during this turn was immense. Every instinct screamed to head directly for the runway, but physics demanded the seemingly suicidal detour. The last 5 minutes of Flight 236 compressed a lifetime of flying experience into a few critical decisions. Rodriguez lined up with the runway centerline, configuring the aircraft for landing while maintaining precise airspeed control. Without flaps, which required hydraulic power they didn't have, the approach speed was 50% higher than normal. First Officer Chin called out altitudes and airspeeds, providing crucial information to help Rodriguez judge the approach. The runway lights grew larger in the windscreen, but there would be no go-around if this approach didn't work. No second chances, no margin for error. At 200 knots faster than cars travel on highways, the aircraft descended toward a runway that looked impossibly short and narrow from their perspective. Behind them, 293 passengers braced for impact, not knowing whether they were about to experience a landing or a crash. When 400,000 pounds of aircraft meets runway at 200 knots, the result is more controlled crash than graceful landing. Flight 236 hit the runway with tremendous force, immediately blowing out 8 of its 12 tires. The aircraft bounced, actually became airborne again for a few seconds, before slamming back down onto the concrete. Without engine reverse thrust and with limited spoiler effectiveness, the aircraft wasn't slowing down as quickly as normal. The anti-skid braking system, which prevents will lock-up during normal landings, was inoperative. When Rodriguez applied maximum braking, the wheels locked up and began skidding, generating friction sparks and wearing the tires down to their metal rims. The screeching sound was audible throughout the aircraft as metal scraped against concrete, throwing up showers of sparks in the darkness. Even after the aircraft finally stopped, the emergency wasn't over. Friction from the skidding tires had started fires in the main landing gear and smoke was beginning to enter the cabin. Rodriguez ordered an immediate evacuation and the flight attendants sprang into action. In less than 90 seconds, a phenomenal achievement under the circumstances, all 306 people evacuated the aircraft using emergency slides. The speed and efficiency of this evacuation probably prevented additional casualties as the landing gear fires could have spread to fuel vapors or other aircraft systems. Airport firefighters were in position and quickly extinguished the fires, but the image of passengers sliding down emergency chutes in the middle of the night, with fire trucks and ambulances surrounding the aircraft, captured the dramatic conclusion to their ordeal. Everyone survived, though several passengers sustained minor injuries during the evacuation. Within hours of the landing, investigators from multiple countries converged on the Azores. The aircraft's flight data recorder and cockpit voice recorder, the famous black boxes, were recovered and analyzed. What they revealed was a complex story of mechanical failure, human psychology, and extraordinary airmanship. The fuel leak was traced to the maintenance error days earlier, validating the investigators' initial suspicions. But the human factors aspects of the incident proved even more fascinating to safety experts. The recordings revealed how 2 experienced, competent pilots had fallen into well-documented psychological traps that prevented them from recognizing their situation until it was almost too late. The case became a textbook study in aviation psychology and human factors training. Aviation psychologists studying Flight 236 identified it as a perfect case study in how cognitive biases affect decision-making under stress. The pilots demonstrated confirmation bias by interpreting new information to support their initial belief that the instruments were malfunctioning. They showed framing bias in their risk assessment decisions, choosing uncertain catastrophic outcomes over certain moderate losses. The incident also illustrated the availability heuristic, the tendency to judge probability based on how easily we can remember similar events. Neither pilot had experience with fuel leaks, so their brains assigned a low probability to this explanation for their symptoms. These aren't character flaws or training deficiencies, they're fundamental aspects of how human brains process information under stress. Understanding these patterns has led to improved training programs and decision-making tools for pilots worldwide. From an engineering perspective, Flight 236 revealed several important lessons about aircraft design and maintenance procedures. The fuel leak warning system, which should have alerted the pilots to the massive fuel loss, didn't activate because the leak was located in a position that the sensors couldn't detect. Airbus subsequently modified their fuel monitoring systems to provide better leak detection. The maintenance error that caused the leak highlighted the need for better part identification systems and more rigorous inspection procedures. The incident also demonstrated that modern aircraft, despite their sophisticated automation, still depend critically on human decision-making in emergency situations. No amount of technology can substitute for proper training and sound judgment when facing unprecedented situations. The story of Flight 236 captured international attention, with media outlets struggling to balance the heroic aspects of the successful landing against the troubling questions about how the situation developed. Initial reports focused on the miraculous nature of the landing, the longest unpowered flight in commercial aviation history with no fatalities. But as investigation details emerged, coverage became more complex. Some reports criticized the pilots for not recognizing the fuel leak sooner, while others praised their airmanship under impossible conditions. The passengers, initially grateful simply to be alive, began asking harder questions about airline maintenance procedures and pilot training. The incident became a case study in crisis communication, demonstrating how the same event can be framed as either a heroic success or a preventable failure, depending on perspective and timing. Flight 236 prompted significant changes in aviation regulations and training requirements worldwide. Aviation authorities mandated improved fuel leak detection systems on all new aircraft and retrofit programs for existing fleets. Pilot training curricula were updated to include more emphasis on fuel management and leak recognition procedures. Maintenance training programs added specific focus on part identification and verification procedures to prevent the type of error that initiated this crisis. Perhaps most importantly, airlines began incorporating human factors training that specifically addressed cognitive biases and decision-making under stress. The goal was to help pilots recognize when their natural psychological responses might be leading them away from optimal solutions to complex problems. Captain Rodriguez and First Officer Chen faced intense scrutiny in the months following the incident. While praised for their handling of the unpowered landing, they were also criticized for not recognizing the fuel leak sooner. Both pilots struggled with the psychological aftermath of the event, the knowledge that their decisions had put 306 people at risk balanced against the reality that their skills had ultimately saved everyone aboard. They became reluctant celebrities in the aviation world, speaking at safety conferences and training seminars about their experience. Their honest discussions of the psychological factors that influenced their decision-making helped other pilots understand how cognitive biases could affect their own performance in emergencies. Both continued flying, carrying with them hard-won insights about the interaction between human psychology and aircraft systems. For the 293 passengers aboard Flight 236, the psychological impact of the incident varied dramatically. Some experienced post-traumatic stress that made future flying difficult or impossible. Others reported feeling more confident about aviation safety, having witnessed firsthand the skill and dedication of professional flight crews under extreme pressure. Several passengers maintained contact with each other years after the incident, bound together by their shared experience of facing mortality and survival. The incident became a reference point in their lives, a moment that clarified priorities, strengthened relationships, and provided perspective on everyday problems. Many reported that surviving Flight 236 changed their approach to life, making them more appreciative of ordinary moments and more willing to take positive risks in their personal and professional lives. Flight 230 SIX's legacy extends far beyond the immediate safety improvements it prompted. The incident became a cornerstone case study in aviation training programs worldwide, used to teach everything from technical emergency procedures to human factors and decision-making under stress. The successful unpowered landing demonstrated the importance of fundamental flying skills even in an age of increasing automation. It validated the investment in comprehensive pilot training and the value of experience in handling unprecedented situations. The incident also contributed to broader discussions about the interaction between human operators and complex technical systems, influencing design philosophies in industries ranging from nuclear power to medical devices. The lessons learned from Flight 236 continue to save lives decades after the event, preventing similar incidents through improved training, procedures, and technology. Flight 236 raises profound questions that extend beyond aviation safety into fundamental issues of human nature and decision-making. How do we prepare for situations that have never occurred before? How do we overcome cognitive biases that served our ancestors well but can be dangerous in modern technical environments? How do we balance the benefits of automation with the need for human judgment and skill? The incident demonstrates both the fragility and resilience of modern technological systems, how a tiny maintenance error can cascade into a life-threatening emergency, but also how human skill and determination can overcome seemingly impossible odds. Perhaps most importantly, Flight 236 reminds us that behind every safety statistic and technical procedure are real people making difficult decisions under extreme pressure, carrying the weight of others' lives in their hands, and sometimes achieving the extraordinary through a combination of skill, preparation, and sheer determination to survive.